Thank you, Mr. Chair. The following is the hearing on the request of Fred Gluck, appellant, to consider the following appeals filed on March 29, 2006, 06 APL 10 of the Montecito Board of Architectural Review's decision to approve, 05 BAR 172, and 06 APL 13 of the Planning and Development Department's decision to approve, 05 LUP 952.
The way we will proceed this morning is for the staff report to start, followed by the appellant, followed by the applicant, and then public comment. Staff?
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. My name is Aaron Briggs, and I have another brief presentation for you today. I will begin with a quick background, move into the project description and consistency analysis, and conclude with staff's recommendation. Today, the Montecito Planning Commission is asked to consider both staff's approval of the land use permit and the Montecito BAR's approval of the project. The project site is located at 700 Picacho Lane, approximately 300 yards north of East Valley Road. The appellant's residence is located directly north of the Burkhoff property. Here's a photo representing the view off of the Gluck's second-story balcony over the Burkhoff property. Yellow tape connecting the story poles visible here represents the height of a hedge to be maintained at 24 feet. The Burkhoff property is currently vacant. The proposed project is for a land use permit to authorize the construction of a new, approximately 9,860 square foot residence with a 2,000 square foot basement, an 800 square foot guest house, an 800 square foot second story cabana with an 800 square foot garage and accessory structure below, a new pool, spa, and tennis court. The height of the new residence would be approximately 37 feet. Access will be taken from a private driveway via Picacho Lane. Here's a slide showing the site plan. The driveway is outlined there in dark. The proposed residence is located approximately in the center of the lot there. And we have a guest house in the northwest corner and a tennis court and cabana in the southeast corner. It's a picture of the south elevation. Picture of the north elevation, partially visible from the Gluck residence. The east elevation, also partially visible from the Gluck residence and the Nigro property to the east. And the west elevation, probably not visible from anywhere. With respect to staff's approval of the land use permit, staff concluded in its review that the project can be found consistent with the comprehensive plan, including the Montecito Community Plan and the Article 4 zoning requirements, including height. With respect to the Montecito BAR's consideration of the project, the MBAR heard the project on 6 separate occasions and granted preliminary approval with the necessary findings of neighborhood compatibility and floor area. Under the Montecito architectural guidelines, the Montecito BAR is responsible for making these findings. Although the residence would be approximately 18% over the recommended floor area, the Montecito BAR approved the project, citing its compatibility with adjacent properties, many of which are also over the recommended floor area. A study of neighboring actual and recommended floor areas was presented to the Montecito BAR for its consideration. In order to analyze the proposed residence in context with the existing neighborhood, the MBAR applied the Montecito architectural guidelines, including the neighborhood compatibility and view and privacy protection guidelines. This slide summarizes the neighborhood floor area study. In the area studied, the average floor area is 6,640 square feet. The median floor area is 6,275 square feet. The average lot size is 3.2 acres. Also shown are the ranges for floor area and lot size. At 9,860 square feet, the project is amongst the largest in the neighborhood. This slide shows staff looked at a total of 14 properties in the immediate area in order to develop the information presented in attachment F of the staff report and as seen here. This slide shows the study area staff used to collect the data on the previous slide. The Burkhoff property is outlined in white. The floor area study area is outlined in yellow. In summary, the project can be found consistent with the comprehensive plan, including the Montecito Community Plan, and the Article 4 zoning requirements, including height. Additionally, the project received preliminary approval from the Montecito BAR, which made the necessary findings for neighborhood compatibility and floor area by a 6-0 vote. Staff's recommendation is to adopt the required findings for approval of case numbers 05 LUP 952 and 05 BAR 172, and to deny the appeals, case numbers 06 APL number 10 and 13, thereby upholding P&D's approval and grant de novo approval of case numbers 05 LUP 952 and 05 BAR 172. That concludes staff's presentation, unless Mr. Imhoff has anything to add at this point.
Mr. Chair, I'd just like to add briefly that staff has supplemented its staff report with some draft findings for the BAR appeal in the event that the commission is inclined to follow staff's recommendation. This is just a starting point and can be looked at further. Thank you.
Mr. Briggs, would you place a visual on the area that was considered for the neighborhood? How was that area? How is that particular area decided upon?
In this case, I tried to find similar parcel sizes. The parcel sizes in neighborhood vary pretty dramatically, from less than 1 acre to over 12 acres. So I tried to grab as many of the parcels in the immediate vicinity that were similar in size, and then I tried to exclude most of the properties that were smaller, less than 1 acre.
In looking at your visual, are the properties to the west of Picacho larger generally, or are they smaller? Why did you stop at Picacho in effect?
It seems to be an even mix on both sides of Picacho between large and small. The reason I did not include the properties that are directly west of Picacho is that those 4 properties right there are all under common ownership. One person owns all 4 of those, and it just didn't seem like they were individual lots and just didn't seem appropriate for the study.
Commissioner Phillips?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Briggs, wouldn't neighborhood compatibility suggest that the neighborhood be looked at, not properties that are like the property under consideration?
I would generally agree with that. I did include some smaller properties. To be useful, I didn't want the study to go, over 15 to 20 properties. It just, at a certain point, it just becomes too much information. I honestly tried to grab as many of the relevant parcels that were directly adjacent to the Burkhoff property as I could.
But once we're over the guidelines, we now move into compatibility. Finding like-kind properties wouldn't be the test I would use. I think we need to look at the whole neighborhood, the compatibility with the neighborhood. So I question your approach. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, if I could just add to what Aaron has said. Of course, the Montecito architectural guidelines look at floor area and make recommended floor area limits based on parcel size. So parcel size is relevant to the degree that lot size is implicated here. By any measure, this house is larger than average neighborhood sizes. We could have included other parcels. I don't think we would have gotten a different result. This is representative, and this gives the Commission a sense of the size of this project relative to other houses in the neighborhood.
Commissioner Gottsdenker?
Well, I, like Commissioner Phillips, question the fact that those larger parcels to the west were not used as part of the study. Even though they belong to one owner, that's not a rationale for saying we're not going to use those. They are a parcel, and it's just been read to us. That is the consideration. And I know when I sat on MBAR, it was take the parcel, draw a quarter-mile radius or a half-mile radius to determine which parcels are of like size within that quarter or half mile. So, given that I see just roughly at least 4 parcels to the west that have not been included, I think that's I don't think that this neighborhood compatibility study is complete.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, it's always difficult to know how to define neighborhood. That's always a question, and there always can be a debate about that. If the commission wishes, staff can include additional items in that study and augment that study. However, I do think that the result is going to be roughly the same in terms of the bottom line.
And Commissioner Godsnicker, may I add, the applicants did submit their own study to the BAR. And although my study is does not contain exactly the same parcels, I wanted to generally use the same area that they did use. And they didn't include any parcels west of Boccaccio, and I did. So,
Commissioner Tilsher.
Well, I've lived at 550 Boccaccio for 38 years, and the neighborhood's changed, needless to say. But I think, tagging along with Commissioner Gottstanger's comments about the neighborhood and the distance you have to go to get to strike some understanding of the compatibility, we really do have to go a quarter of a mile. A quarter of a mile is not a long ways, but a quarter of a mile takes you down to almost East Valley Road from this property. I'm sure. I paced off from my house, which is the third house up on the right as you come up from East Valley. And it's 607 yards to this particular property. That neighborhood is everything from 3,500 square feet houses to 4,500 square feet houses, and not until you get up the street quite a ways do you get, as you've done here, do you get into a completely different kind of a mix. So, but I don't think it's justified also, I don't think it's justified to take that immediate neighborhood and use that for compatibility. We just get into this constant rub of FARs pushing compatibility because even if it was just match the FARs and the immediate properties, it is still not compatible with the neighborhood at all. So I just have a lot of problems with how we strike that balance between FARs and compatibility, because I don't think compatibility is getting lost, and it's happening on every application now. So I may be out to lunch on this. But
Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The floor area ratio study is a ratio. Tell me again why you're looking for bigger lots. This will work out in the math, I think, if you were to include smaller lots as well, the neighborhood. It says to look at like-kind lots?
Yeah, like-size lots within a neighborhood. And that's consistently what we've done ever since
So it's
the
not
guidelines have been put in
neighborhood
place.
compatibility necessarily,
It's like-size
compatibility
within, yeah. So a neighborhood consisting of, as this does, of mixed-size lots, the guidelines were, the numbers in the guidelines were developed per lot size. We didn't choose to say every building that's built within a given neighborhood shall have, another way of looking at it is a lot coverage of X %. That's another way that other jurisdictions look at it. But we in Montecito chose not to do that. And as, I've just forgotten your name, but anyway, we read from the guidelines, we've always looked at light-size lots within a neighborhood to make the FAR comparisons.
But the percentages should work.
Yes,
One
I
acre,
agree.
it
Yes,
should work.
it should work. All of those houses that are, say, on a 1 acre parcel should be consistent within that area. Houses on a 2 acre parcel should be consistent within that area. And as this is almost a 4 acre parcel, which was why the FAR study was done from almost 3 acres all the way up to 4, and included, I think it's the Lucas property, which is 12, which would naturally, it's interesting because if you actually look at the Lucas piece of property, which is the 12 acre piece of property below the Burkhoff property, it has the same amount of amenities on it as far as guest houses and accessory structures and pool cabanas and all of what Montecito residents seem, want to have on their properties. But as you can see, there's going to be a lot more open space on that property because it necessarily, and in the FAR study, the FAR study brings it below, way below. But that's the nature of having a bigger piece of property. So it's complex. It's kind of complex. You have to look at the proposed development and how it works. And this is one of the things, just I should say, we actually began to look at this at the subcommittee meeting, because I should, as long as we're looking at this, point out that although the guidelines and the ordinances don't allow MBAR to count the amount of floor area that's added to a project by the accessory buildings. There's besides what we're looking at of 9,860 square feet of proposed building, we're also looking at 2,000 square feet of basement that's not counted in that number. We're looking at 4,900 square feet of accessory structure on this property, which is more square footage than a 1 acre parcel, the proposed square footage for a 1 acre parcel. So it's all, for me, it's all kind of, you have to take the whole thing together. And right now, that's not how we do it. And like I said, the subcommittee on Wednesday spent a lot of time looking at how to get at the fact that in my opinion, we are not, with the proliferation of paving and tennis courts and swimming pools and guest houses and cabanas and accessory structures, what we're doing is actually eroding the semi-rural quality of Montecito.
Okay.
And that's where I'm looking from, is like, how much total development is there on a piece of property?
All right, I have some comments on this subject. First of all, these are not floor area ratios. They are not FARs. When I constructed that table, which was about 15 years ago, it was floor area as a function of parcel size, and that was taken from a study of the entire Montecito area and a computer analysis where I selected in effect, those numbers represent the 75th percentile of all houses of a particular size. That was one comment I wanted to make, that this is not a ratio matter. The other comment I want to make is that there is a neighborhood that was defined about 20 years ago for all of Montecito. There are some 60 or 70 neighborhoods in all. And I believe staff has a copy of that, and MBAR also. And in that study, this area was identified as neighborhood number 62. And just as a reference, I'd like to mention what the statistics on that neighborhood are. First of all, it covers the area that goes all the way across to Hot Springs and goes further north up towards East Mountain and down to East Valley. The average parcel size for that neighborhood was 1.8 acres. And the norm, if you like, if every parcel had a house on it built to the guidelines, would have been 5,400 square feet. Actually, the houses that exist on the parcels in this neighborhood, the average is around 4,000 square feet. So looking at this in a global sense, this is a very high area, house size area specific to one fragment of the neighborhood, of the formal neighborhood as defined some time ago. So we have to consider it in that context. But I think there is a valid concern here that perhaps the neighborhood that's selected is a bit too limited, and we ought to extend beyond that. So that's as much as I want to say at the moment. I believe Commissioner Tilcher is the next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I live at 550 Picacho, which I paced off is 607 yards from the applicant's property. And I know that there's a conflict of interest if you're within 500 yards. So I paced that off 3 times. I was very careful about it because it came up on another application on the Sperling property. So unless my pace is way off, I'm okay. So I'll participate.
All right, Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just briefly, it seems to me there's a number of ways to look at this, but is it the sense of my colleagues here that we need one way, in fairness to property owners, that we need a consistent approach? And I had no idea there was numbered neighborhoods, but that would be an interesting beginning, I think. Let's look at the neighborhood. And selectively drawing these lines may well be fair. I don't know, but it may not.
Commissioner Bierig.
Well, my comment to this line of discussion would be that I think maybe we need to look at the fact that the guidelines are subjective; they're not objective, and we're not really going to produce a totally objective standard here. What I remember from my time on the Montecito Association's Architectural Review Committee is that oftentimes what we did is we looked at these numbers. It was just one factor. Size was one factor. And then we looked at what did the neighbors think of it? You know, did they satisfy the neighbors? How visible was it? And so I think if we concentrate too much on trying to set an objective standard, we may miss the boat on what we're really trying to do, which is have this house, what we end up with here, be compatible with the neighbors and have the neighbors feel comfortable about it. And I think if we put it in that context, we may approach this differently than simply trying to set an objective standard and then say it either is or it isn't within that standard.
Mr. Chair, can I make a suggestion? We've not even heard from the appellant or the project applicant yet, let alone the public members, and you're feeling like you're deliberating. So can I suggest that maybe we keep this in mind as people testify and go ahead and receive testimony, and we can continue the discussion. And you know, we can look at the guidelines and go through that and try and figure out how they should be applied. But I think you should hear the testimony first.
Thank you, Secretary. I raised a question initially to understand the criteria by which neighborhood was selected, but evidently I opened Pandora's box here and got into much more than I had anticipated. But Mr. Briggs had some comment he wanted to make.
I'll keep it brief. I just wanted to say that the Commission's remarks regarding floor area are duly noted and much appreciated. And in the future, we will expand the neighborhood floor area study for your consideration.
Okay. I think we'll have more to say on this when we come back for deliberation after we've heard the appellant and the applicant. All right. Having said that, I invite the appellant to come to the podium.
Good morning, Commissioner McGreblian, and members of the Commission. It's nice to see you this morning. My name is Derek Weston. I'm here on behalf of Fred and Linda Gluck, my clients, and also been assisted by David Grochenberger, who has helped them in earlier stages of this proceeding. I want to start by thanking staff for their efforts and for their, especially for their efforts at helping the parties achieve a resolution. They put a great deal of effort into it. It was well done, and we appreciate it very much. As a housekeeping matter, I want to be clear that I have filed 2 letters recently, one dated June 19th and one dated June 20th, and I brought additional copies of those in case each of you don't have them or if anybody else would like a copy. One of them is a longer letter with a number of exhibits, and then a 3-page letter with 2 exhibits that I filed yesterday, and which I'll put up on overheads. We think that this is really a relatively simple matter. We urge you to grant these appeals on 2 separate grounds. First, because we believe that the project does not comply with the Montecito size guidelines, but also because it does not comply with the requirements for neighborhood compatibility and the good neighbor policies that are set forth in the Montecito Community Plan. So as several of you have already mentioned, every project, every residential project in Montecito has to meet 2 separate standards. One of those standards is to comply with the maximum size guidelines for principal residence that are set forth in the guidelines. And those have been discussed extensively. Those guidelines do not include accessory structures, basements, cabanas, pools, all those other things. It just deals with the maximum size of the principal residence. But there is a separate standard that also has to be met, and that is that every project has to be compatible with the existing developed neighborhood. And that policy comes from 2 different sources. One, it is stated in those words, I believe verbatim, in Land Use Visual Element Policy number 2. I think I got that right, Diane. The visual policy requires that all new projects of every kind be compatible with the existing developed neighborhood. And second, it's reflected in the Montecito guidelines specifically. It says that every project, and this is quoted in my first letter to you, every project that is significantly larger than its neighbors has a burden of proof of showing that it can't be seen in order to establish compatibility. Now what that means is that if you have a neighborhood of relatively small homes way under the guidelines, and someone proposes a large project that is out of proportion to the neighbors, then that project is not compatible with the neighborhood, even if it is way under the guidelines. And the converse is also true. If you were to have a neighborhood with a number of homes over the size guidelines, and someone proposed a project that was even larger than that, that project would also be incompatible on neighborhood compatibility. So it is an independent standard. And Commissioner Gottstenger referred to both of these standards, and I think it's important that we draw a distinction between the 2. It is quite correct that the size guidelines that are in the table that Commissioner McGriblian worked on a number of years ago, those reflect acreage. So it is appropriate, if you are applying that standard, that you look at other parcels in that, well, I actually have to correct what I said. If you're applying that standard, you just look at the standard. It applies on a per lot basis. But if you are looking at neighborhood compatibility, you really have to look at the larger neighborhood. Whether the lots are large or small is completely irrelevant. And that is just a separate standard entirely. And I believe Commissioner Gottstenger stated that view because she ended up by saying one needs to look at the totality. And we have brought you data that we think will be helpful because we think that this proposed project fails both standards, both the FAR standard by which it exceeds 18% and certainly the neighborhood compatibility. So when Fred and Linda Gluck purchased their property, if you'd help me by putting those 2 slides up real quickly. Oh, there we are. This was the ocean view from their patio. This is the view they had from their entire ground floor. And from their second floor, of course, they had a slightly more panoramic view. That view looks toward the south and southeast and over the property now owned by the Burkhoff Trust. At the time they purchased their property, it was both marketed to them and sold as a panoramic view property. You have a letter that is attached, 2 letters, excuse me, to my original submission to you June 19th, both from the owner who sold the lot to the Glucks and from the broker confirming those facts and that there was no landscaping or other obstruction to that view. Now, of course, the Glucks know that there will be a house next door to them. They welcome having a new neighbor. They know that they will probably see the house because their house is located higher than that property and have no objection whatsoever. Their only request is that the house be reasonable, that it be compatible with the neighborhood, and that its details be designed in a way so that it does not unreasonably impact the enjoyment of their own property. So let me turn now to the data that we have assembled on the Burkhoff project. And thank you very much, Aaron, again. This data is attached to the letter I sent you yesterday. It's a little hard to read on this overhead, but and I don't know if we can magnify that at all.
Mr. Chair, could I excuse Mr. Weston? We don't have that letter. I don't know if the commission does. They may, but I can't find it in my packet, and no one else can.
I have to agree with counsel. I don't have a copy of that letter either.
I don't.
Yes, I emailed it, but only recently. But I'll run through the essence of the letter. The letter consists essentially of the points that I've made right now regarding size and this chart, but it'll be a little easier if you look at the one right in front of you. So here's what this chart shows. The Burkhoff project, all by itself, is the largest residence in this entire study area. Now, in order to give you a like-kind comparison, we simply used the identical properties that the applicant themselves used. I think it is quite correct that you should be looking at the larger neighborhood, but we wanted to show that even using their comparables, their project is the largest project. So what this shows is that the entire project, if you look at the principal residence, which is 9,860 square feet, and you add the additional living space of 2,400 square feet, the total livable area is 12,260. That is the largest house, by far, of any of the houses in the project area. And we have also done a comparative study, again using just the comparables which the applicant themselves used, to give you a sense of how much larger this house is than all of the other houses in the neighborhood. And if you'll put up the next one, this data can be clearly shown in a graphical form. So the green bars represent the average size of the principal residence alone of all of the homes in the applicant's study area. It's almost the same as staff study area. So this green bar represents the average size of the average house. The proposed Burkhoff resident is 154% of the average size, just of the principal residence. But of course, they have taken advantage of exceptions in the guidelines. They have an additional 800 square foot accessory structure, an additional 800 square foot guest house, I believe on top of the accessory structure, so that's a two-story structure, a third 800 square foot structure, which is a cabana. And in addition, there is a 2,000 square foot basement. But if you only look at the 2,400 square feet of three additional 800 square foot structures and add those to the principal residence, that's the amount of livable space. That's what this second group of bars show. And in this case, their proposed Burkhoff project is 169% of the average homes in all the neighborhood, counting all of the accessory structures. And then finally, if you add basements, their project is even larger because they have a 2,000 square foot basement. Doing the same comparison, again using their data, you'll see that their house, their proposed project is 193% of the average of all of the houses in their study area, counting all accessory structures and basements. And the reason is, if I just finish the sentence, the reason is that relatively few of the other homes have significant additional accessory structures, and I think only 2 of them have any basement areas at all. Yes, Commissioner.
Mr. Weston, in your first bar chart there, the green is, would you describe now again the green and the red?
Yes. And also if you look at this is a chart that graphs the data that I showed you on the previous slide. So the green bar is the average of all 13 or 14 homes in the applicant study, the average size of the actual principal residence, not counting cabanas, pools, guest house, accessory structures, or basements. So this average size, which I think it's a little bit over 6,000 square feet, is that narrow neighborhood. I think if we went down to the bottom of Picacho, this number would drop down significantly. And then this is the same data counting accessory structures, and the third set is the same data counting basements. Have I answered your question?
And the red, that is the proposal?
Yes, yes. So this green bar is the average. The red is the proposed project, and then this scatter line calculates the percentage by which the green bar in each, the red bar in each instance exceeds the green bar. So the principal, all by itself, the principal residence is 154% of the average. Okay. Have I
Thank you.
answered the question?
Commissioner Tilcher.
Now,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Weston, why do I remember detached guest houses have to be maximum of 800 square feet, which this is, but must be on a 5-acre parcel minimum?
I
No.
believe it's 2 acres.
2 acre.
Two. Where did the 5-acre?
Yes,
Oh, that's right. Thank you.
Now, I want to point out that this data actually favors the applicant. And the reason is that all of the data on our table, the 13 or 14 homes, was supplied by the county assessor's office. And the county assessor's office uses gross square footage for all of their square footage calculations because they have no way of calculating Montecito's unusual method of calculating interior walls, which we use for the size guidelines on principal residence. So that means, if you go back and look at the chart, if you'd be good enough to put that up, Aaron, for me. Looking at this chart from, this table from which that chart is displayed, this very first line is really comparing to the rest in an apples and orange basis, because I'm quite sure that these square footage figures that have been supplied by the applicant are the net square footage figures that are used for Montecito's guideline purposes. But all of the other figures are gross square footages. So I have run some quick calculations. If we assume that the actual residence from exterior walls is, say, 8% larger, and is probably somewhere between 8 and 15% larger would be my guess, but just using 8%, then, of course, the proposed project on an apples-to-apples basis is even larger. It's about 15,500 feet, which means that it's close to 200% larger than the average of total residences.
Commissioner Phillips.
Mr. Weston, I don't want to interrupt your presentation, and of course, you should continue. But you may well be right that this may be a better way to look at it, but that's not how we calculate it. It's simply 18% over, isn't it?
With all respect, Commissioner Phillips, I disagree. I believe it is your charge to look at it in two different ways. Yes, one set of guidelines deals with the size of a principal residence alone. It is a maximum. It's maximum recommended size. There is a separate standard that derives both from land use visual element policy number 2 and from the Montecito guidelines that says that a residence that is out of scale with its neighbors has an extra burden of proof. And if you turn, for example, to my letter dated June 19th, which I believe you do have on page 4 near the top, there is a paragraph in the guidelines which states, a project with a floor area size substantially in excess of the floor area of the immediately surrounding properties will have the burden of demonstrating that the project cannot be viewed by surrounding property owners due to siting, or that its special volume, mass, bulk, and scale, when taken together with lot size, setbacks, and landscaping, does not make it incompatible with similar surrounding properties. Now, what's interesting about that language is that it does not refer at all to the size guidelines. It is a separate standard. That's why I said at the beginning of my presentation that if you have a neighborhood of small homes well under the current guidelines, let's assume they're all 1-acre lots and the guidelines would allow 4,000 feet. If you have if all the homes are 1,000 square feet, someone really can't come in and put in a 4,000 square foot house even though it meets the guidelines, because it violates neighborhood compatibility. It immediately depreciates the value of all the other homes. So it is a separate standard. So with all respect, I think you have to do both.
So, Mr. Weston, in the first instance, you do not count the 2,000 square foot basement, if that's
Correct.
the number. But in the second instance, the neighborhood compatibility issue, you do get to count it?
I think you should. I think it is a factor that you should look at among all of the factors you are evaluating. I think Commissioner Gottstanker put it very well, or I'm sorry, Commissioner Bierig put it very well. It is appropriate when you're looking at compatibility to look at the entire picture. This is not a mathematical exercise. I know that talented architects can build houses that are oversized in the sense that they exceed the guidelines, but they're so well designed and they're so well sited that they don't affect the neighborhood at all. And by contrast, I know houses that are well within the guidelines that just look awful because they are in everybody's face. So this data is a guideline. I think that it is a mistake to only look at the square footage under the guidelines because it allows talented architects to game the system. It allows them to add lots and lots of extra square footage and architectural projections and connecting breezeways and arbors and all of these things that don't count on the square footage, but that we all see and that affect the neighborhood. So I think you have to look at both. Now, I'm not saying that a project cannot exceed the average, but if you are looking at compatibility, it is very appropriate to look at everything.
Please continue with your presentation.
So I do want to talk about the 4 homes. I implied in my letter incorrectly, and I apologize that all of the homes that were in excess of the guidelines had been built before the guidelines went into effect. That's not correct. 3 of the 7 homes that are in excess of the guidelines were built before, and 4 of them were built after. 2 of them, and if you would help me, Aaron, by moving that just a little to the right, and no, the other way, and then up a little bit. You'll see that one of the homes that is over is on a parcel that's less than 1 acre. And that house itself is not particularly large. It's only 6,000 square feet and has relatively little extra space. So the whole house is 6,700 square foot. The other parcel, which is over, is this one, 735 Picacho. It's also a relatively small parcel. And that house, on 1.12 acres, that house is almost 6,800 square feet, has no additional structures and no basements. Now there is the house of the appellants, Fred and Linda Gluck. That is the house which, as you correctly point out, is 18% over the guidelines themselves. It is on quite a large parcel. And it does not have any additional accessory structures except for a single cabana, which, let me see if I can look up the number. I think it's 160 square feet. So that total structure of the appellants is only slightly over the average of all of the structures in the neighborhood, because the entire project is only, if I can help me look here on the thing, the entire residence, counting all of the structures and basements, is 8,700 square feet. So I do think that that is an appropriate factor. If you look at that project, for example, which is the appellant's project is 8,700 square feet, and you compare it using correct numbers to the proposed project, that project will be at 15,500 square feet, almost double. Now there is one residence, which I mentioned in this latest letter, which is right here at 730 Picacho. That is on a relatively large parcel, 4 acres, and it is definitely over the size guidelines. It's 10,000 square feet, and it does have some additional square footage, an additional 1,135. And if it's difficult for you to read this on the chart, it is attached to the June 20 letter. So the question that I have, and I think the community has, is this. If one house is over the guidelines, should it be treated as an aberration, or should it set a new high bar, which is the standard that everyone then can exceed? And I think the answer the community give is just crystal clear. If that was an error, it's one that we should learn from, not repeat. And it certainly should not be used, as it is in this case, as a stepping stone for a yet even larger project. Because the project proposed by the applicants is even larger than this one house, which I think most would say is an aberration. Now, that house was approved very shortly after the guidelines were adopted, when I think we were still learning all of the implications. It is 10 years ago. And that particular house does not block anyone's view. It is the house over which the Glucks enjoy their ocean view. And if you look at that, you don't need to put it up, Aaron, but if you look at that very first photograph, they are looking over that relatively large house. So although it's large, I'm not sure it's objectionable. And I'm quite sure that it does not block or interfere anybody else's view. But nonetheless, the real question is, should that house set the standard for the entire neighborhood? And I think everybody would say, no, it should not. If you were to reach the opposite conclusion and say that that house sets a new standard and that therefore this proposed house can be even larger, there's no end to that arms race. I think the cat would then be out of the bag, because everyone would then be able to say, well, you just approved a 15,500 square foot house and mine is only 17,000, and then we'd be off and running. So I think we owe it to the community to do what sometimes is hard and simply exercise restraint. And I don't think that this proposed project does that. I want to be clear that this is not just, yes?
Before I forget my question, thank you, Mr. Chair. I, as you know, viewed the property from the Gluck's house yesterday.
Yes.
And you were there, and Mr. Gluck.
We appreciate that.
I could not tell without story poles if you can see the proposed home at all. If it turns out you can't, is the size still a concern for you?
Yes, and first of all, I want to correct something during our meeting yesterday, and we appreciate it very much that you visited both our property and the applicant's property. I stated that story poles had never been erected, and I've been informed that by the chair of the MBR that is incorrect, so I apologize. Apparently, story poles were erected. It was before I was representing the Glucks, and I don't know that we have photographs documenting it. What I believe happened on that occasion excuse me? Go ahead. What I believe happened was that at that time, to be perfectly frank, the appellants expected that they would be given either by the applicants or by the MBR itself some significant view protection. In all of the early meetings before the MBAR, there were a number of discussions of specific heights of landscaping and how that landscaping would affect the view of the Glucks. And from I can't remember whether there were 5 or 6 meetings, I think 6. All of those discussions, very specific discussions of how high landscaping could be before it impeded the Gluck's view. So they went into the very last hearing believing that that issue was appreciated and would be addressed. And they did not press as hard their concerns about size. It became clear in the final resolution of the MBAR, however, that there are no conditions that really restrict landscaping, so they really would have nothing. But to answer your question, yes, size matters even if they cannot see the house. Part of the reason that we all stay here or live here is because house sizes have been reasonable, and there is so much air and light and space and landscaping around every home. And it colors the entire community. It's what makes Montecito, in my judgment. What's difficult is that if you look at any one house that's oversized, it doesn't do that much harm. You can say, well, the neighbor still has lots of room. But if that sets a trend and all the houses become large, the fabric of the community changes. That's why there are more people here than just the Glucks. The Glucks filed this appeal, and in something that I'm not sure has ever happened in my many years of experience on land use cases, we did not call any neighbors, not one. We didn't recruit any support. We didn't send out letters. We didn't do anything at all. Many people have called us and asked how they can help and said they are very concerned about this proposed project. For example, Richard Filippini, who was the neighbor immediately to the south of the project, called and asked if he could actually join the appeal, which he he wants to do, and he is here today. The neighbor to the east, Mr. Nigro, is here to support the appeal. I believe the neighbor who lives to the north, the Steinkellners, are here, and one other neighbor to the northwest. So all of the neighbors, I think, immediately surround the property are concerned. And we've had people from other parts of Montecito, from Burnham Wood, and members of the Montecito Association itself call to say, we think that a course correction needs to be made. It's out of hand. And that's, I'm trying to answer your question directly, that's because size matters. It really does, in abstract terms, except in unusual cases where a house really can't be seen, has no impact. There are unusual topography situations. But this house is going to be seen not only by the Glucks, or the applicants say they won't see it because they're proposing to put up a hedge which will block it, but then the hedge wipes out the ocean view as well. But it'll be seen by people below. I want to emphasize the Glucks expect to see a house. They expect to lose part of their view. All they're asking for is some reasonableness and sense of balance. And we think that because the house is so large, it is forcing it farther to the east and more into their view and more up than would be the case if there weren't so much square footage. So the square footage actually affects the overall design. So I have just very few additional comments unless there's an additional question.
I would like for the speaker to continue, and let's hold some of our questions so he has a chance to express himself.
I don't mind the questions, Commissioner McGurley.
Please continue.
Just one final point. During the, I've reviewed the final conclusions of the MBAR, and they approved a landscaping plan. That landscaping plan does not show a line of redwood trees that was planted along the border, and which in a relatively few number of months has already grown up to obscure the view from the ground floor and patio of the Gluck home. So those trees are not shown on the landscaping plan, but there are no restrictions in the landscaping plan that will prevent them from being replanted, that require they be removed, or that other big trees won't be planted. So if this project were approved, the Glucks would really be enormously impacted. And in all honesty, we believe it's inappropriate. We think for the two basic reasons we've cited, both the fact that it is 18% over the guidelines, which is significant, and I think if you look at the exceptions to that, they should not set the bar, but also for the general determination of neighborhood compatibility. If this project were approved, this would be one further step toward the mansionization of Montecito, and I think nobody supports that approach. So I appreciate your courtesy in letting me make a long presentation. I would like to add that I have very consciously focused solely on the land use issues that are before us. If other issues come before you, I hope I will have an opportunity to respond. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Tilshire, did you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When I was up at Mr. Gluck's home yesterday, and we were on the ground level, as you remember, and then we went on the second floor level. And I had previously been down at the applicant's home, so I pretty well had a concept of where that property, how far east it goes into that view area that Mr. Gluck is primarily concerned with. I may be off a few feet, but I really felt like I don't think the house size, because of the existing vegetation, those trees blocking from between the Gluck's house and the proposed house are the issue. I felt the issue was the 24-foot hedge and that view corridor going across the southeast portion of the applicant's property. I think some of your comments are very valid about the problem of setting precedents with large homes in Montecito, and where is it going to go? But in this particular instance, if the hedge was limited to 16 or 18 feet instead of 24 feet, and you were able to reach some kind of a written agreement between the two parties that that's going to be maintained at that height, would that resolve some of the conflict?
Yes, it would resolve some, for sure. It's unfortunate that we don't have good documentation of the story poles, which evidently went up before. So I was not involved. I don't know if the Glucks were even represented at that time. So it's unfortunate we can't pin down your judgment that the house will not be terribly visible. I hope you're correct. I'm concerned that you're not, and I just don't know how to get a better answer than that. This case is unusual in that you've been given a lot of information about the efforts by the parties themselves to resolve this case. And in my view, my judgment, the Glucks have been extremely forthcoming in being willing to accept perhaps far more obstruction to their views than I think I would have been willing to accept in an effort to be good neighbors. They really do try to be good neighbors. I know I've spoken to one of the neighbors who had some trees on the Glucks property that interfered with their views, and the Glucks voluntarily cut them down because they were trying to cooperate. So we would much prefer a residence that was smaller and located farther to the west. And when the Glucks purchased their property, they were shown by the original subdivider of the whole area a schematic that showed a relatively small home on what now is the Burkhoff property toward the northwest that wouldn't have been visible or affected them in any way at all. Now, the owner's not obligated to do that. But I mention it because if the house were smaller, it could be moved farther to the west and the impacts would then be eliminated. But to answer your question directly, if an agreement were reached where the hedge height really was kept to a reasonable level, say 16 feet, that would make a huge difference to the Glucks. Now, they do retain concerns about overall size, and I think you'll hear from other people today. Many people are concerned about the precedent that is a bad precedent that would be set by allowing too large a residence. So they're separate issues. The Glucks have their own personal issue and what they're willing to accept, and then the community at large has standards that they're concerned about. If the Glucks are willing to accept something that they're willing to live with, that preserves some of their view, but the community is still concerned, I think you still have work to do. So we will continue to do our very best to achieve a resolution and to be fair and reasonable. We have tried to. But I do think there are two separate issues, the broader concern, which they share, and then their own personal concern. It is really important to them to preserve a significant portion of that view over the ocean with something that's meaningful. And you don't want to have, you don't want to have the county, I'm sure Diane will confirm that she doesn't want to have us calling planning and development saying, gee, the trees are getting a little too tall. So it needs to be structured in a way that allows the applicants and the neighbors to work this out without involving the county.
And you have the additional problem, if they sold the property, how would that covenant that you've agreed to continue?
And we have to find a structure where it really continues. I mean, we don't know whether the applicants will build this house and sell it or live there a long time. Certainly the Glucks will not live in their house forever. That's why I've tried to combine my comments to the land use issues. The issues that are raised are these buildings, not the personalities involved. We need to do what's right for the community and for these properties and find a fair and balanced solution and not be too concerned about individuals.
Thank you.
Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Weston, I think it's important that we try to agree on a couple of things. There is a very great distinction between the proposed structure blocking a view and vegetation blocking a view.
Yes.
And that indeed in California we have no legal right to a view blocked by vegetation. There's some remedies perhaps here in Montecito and I'm sure in other jurisdictions as to citing the good neighbor policy, things that we'll be hearing more about. But it is a big difference. And
yes.
without me knowing where that house is, I'm really constrained. And But I don't want to, you were talking about the Glucks view. It's their view as long as it's a view in some senses, in some areas. So, I mean, that is the case.
Well, it's quite correct, that, of course, that California law as a whole has not historically protected private views. That's crystal clear. But that's not the only law that's applicable, because we also have Montecito guidelines. And we also have Montecito policies. And if you look at page 3 of my original letter, we quote them all. The siting of new structures in relationship to existing structures should take into account the impact upon views from neighboring sites. The height and roof pitch should take into account their impact on views from neighboring sites. Structures should be located and designed to avoid obstructing views from living areas of adjacent properties. That is a binding requirement in Montecito's ordinance. You can do anything you want in your ordinances, and that's where it is. So it's not a matter of California state law. It's a matter of Santa Barbara County ordinances and regulations. And all of this is is an effort to achieve community compatibility. I share with you the wish that we had story polls today, and maybe that's something we can still do if it would be helpful, but we're certainly open to it. But I do think that, and I know that MBAR paid attention to this issue. The way I would encourage you to get a handle on it is this. The applicants are clearly asking for something that is in excess of the square foot guidelines by 18% and dramatically in excess of the community standards. That means that you have full discretion. You can say no, you can grant the appeal and send it back for further review before MBAR, or you can invite the applicant to offer reasonable conditions. But you certainly have discretion. I do not think you are stuck because the house itself is so large. You may disagree with my view, but I have no doubt that if you came to the conclusion that this house, as proposed, was not compatible with the existing developed community, that is a valid, sustainable decision. And that means you have full discretion.
That may well be, but it's not going to improve your view, I'm afraid.
Possible.
Thank you.
Commissioner Gotzenker.
One of the things that I know is required on MBAR applications is the location of the residences surrounding the applicant's piece of property. And I notice on none of the material that we have received do we have a location of the Gluck's residence or the Nigros residence or whoever's to the west in relationship to. I see. I do know that we have an aerial view.
Yes.
But the aerial view only has a block of something that says approved building site.
It's a satellite
it does
photo.
not literally this information does not tell me exactly how far to the east and west the Burkhoff house actually is going to be located on site. So there's missing information for me that if it's possible, and one of the places that I would propose that staff go, which you may have here on site, is the fire department overhead mapping that was done a couple of years ago. I mean, I know the Montecito Association has that information. I personally have that information, although not with me. I would expect that the county might be able to have that information available. So that is a missing for me in trying to locate the relationship of the Gluck residence in relationship to the totality of the Burkhoff proposed project.
Perhaps staff would like to comment on that.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Gottstanker, staff does have several other photos from the Gluck residence showing the broad panorama, which we've just put into our slide presentation, and we can show the commission. That may help to get a little bit better sense. We can also measure distances on plans or in the county's GIS photo mapper and to give you exact distances and relationships, if that is helpful.
Okay. That would be helpful. Any other questions for Mr. Weston? Thank you, Mr. Weston.
Thank you very much for the time and for your questions. It was very helpful.
Before we proceed, I'd like to ask, first of all, to take this document that Mr. Weston has provided as to read into the record. There are two documents, the 19th and the 20th, am I correct?
Correct.
Yes, of June. Is there a motion?
I so move that we accept the letters of June 19th and June 20th from Mr. Weston.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion is carried. Second item It's clear that Commissioner Tilshire has visited the site and Commissioner Phillips. Have any of the other commissioners visited the site?
I have not visited the site.
Commissioner Gottstanker?
No, in recent times, I have not visited the site.
I did visit the site. Okay, let's see. The next speaker will be the applicant, have an opportunity to express their views. And I noticed that Chairman Span is here from the MBAR, and perhaps at the conclusion of the applicant's remarks, he may wish to make some comments, and if we have any questions, we have an opportunity to do so then.
Chairman McGreblian, members of the commission, my name is Chris Jacobs. I'm an attorney at Hatch & Parent. I represent the applicant, in this case the Burkhoff Trust. I have also submitted a letter which I assume that you all received. It was timely submitted, and so I'm presuming that it is already included within the administrative record of this proceeding. I'm not going to go into the details of that letter because it would take a long time, and I think it's fairly well stated. I have a couple of other people who would also like to testify on behalf of the applicant. Rob Lowe is here on behalf of the Burkhoff Trust. Chip Woolbrandt, an attorney at Price, Bostel and Parma, who represents the prior owner and who has some information on the historic nature of the perimeter screening that exists on the property, is also here and will be pleased to offer testimony. And Suzanne Elledge, the applicant's land use planner, has some comments to make in terms of the community compatibility standards. I'd like to start the presentation.
Let me ask Mr. Jacobs. Now, these are individuals who are part of the applicant's presentation?
They are.
Very well. Would you repeat the individuals again?
The individuals who will be testifying are Rob Lowe,
right,
Chip Woolbrandt, and Suzanne Elledge.
Thank you.
I think that Mr. Weston's presentation was probably at least an hour. I don't think we will approach that.
We tend to be quite tolerant of both the applicant and staff.
We appreciate that. I want to start my presentation by talking about the iterative process that led to the plan that was unanimously approved by the MBAR on March 20th. It was not simply taking a floor plan and a site plan and elevations and plopping them in the center of the lot. We didn't do that at all. We carefully looked at the neighborhood compatibility standards that are set forth in the Montecito guidelines, and we sited the house in a manner that we believe is consistent with those standards. And I would like to have, Aaron, if I could get you to put the applicable standard in terms of siting up. Raise it up. Just raise it up. It's fine. Just raise the whole sheet up. I think we'll do it. Basically, the guideline talks about siting the residence, so it's not directly in line with other existing residences that are in the immediate neighborhood. The goal is, to the extent there are view corridors, to try and respect those view corridors to the extent feasible. And I believe that we have in fact done that. If you go out to the site, and I know several of you have been out there, you can see that the superior viewpoint in this instance would be to move the house further to the east. That would give an unobstructed ocean view from the house on 700 Picacho Lane. Initially, we thought about putting the house there. In fact, that was where the applicant desired to put the house. This is an extremely expensive piece of property in an area of Montecito where all of the homes are of extremely high quality. They're all estate homes. They all have amenities comparable to those that are proposed by the applicant. We looked at this diagram, and obviously the place for us to have put the house would have been right below the Gluck's house. In this example, within the view shed that's shown on that diagram, and I think I have an aerial photograph that I handed you. Aaron, did I hand you an aerial photograph as well? And this is the one that Commissioner Gottstanker was talking about in terms of the lack of specificity with respect to the placement of the building. But I did the best I could. I stuck those stickers on there. It's my fault. Essentially, we wanted to put the house in the preferred building site, which is shown on this aerial photograph. In fact, that would have put it directly in line with the Gluck's residence. So we compromised from the outset, and we put the house behind a very large oak tree that is existing on the site and is approximately the location of a previous home that was on the site. It was a Chester Garjola home, and it still has some foundation remnants that are visible, and you can see that the motor court for the old Garjola house is immediately to the west of the approved building site sticker that I have on that map. So from a basic siting standpoint, I think that we did what is right and we did what is called for within the Montecito guidelines. Now the guidelines talk about consideration of private views, and in that consideration you also have to balance the equally weighted consideration of privacy, because what makes Montecito is the fact that you do have privacy from most of the building sites, and that's considered to be very desirable. And so the effort was made to try and find a compromise in terms of landscape screening height around the perimeter of the property, such that from 700 Picacho Lane we would not see the Gluck's residence and the Nigro residence, and that we could do that in a manner that would, in effect, not take out the entire view from the Gluck property. And we had a number of meetings. We had meetings, this is the diagram which shows the use of screening and landscape screening particularly to create privacy. And that's what we were trying to do. We were trying to figure out an appropriate screening height. We had, in fact, meetings at the Gluck's residence, and we set up story poles. We set up story poles not just of the house and of the ridge of the house and of the corners of the house and of the pool cabana, but we also set up story poles for purposes of trying to arrive at an appropriate height for the perimeter vegetation. And I have a photograph here which was taken from the Gluck's second floor. This shows the story poles that were set for purposes of determining the perimeter vegetation height. We had lines, string lines, set up at 2-foot intervals from 20 feet to 26 feet.
Would you use a pointer, please?
Yes, if I have a pointer. If you can see this line that goes across like that, is that visible?
Yes.
That is the line that is set at 24 feet. And at those site meetings, it was determined that 24 feet was the appropriate height, because at 24 feet, you could have adequate screening from 700 Picacho without taking out the ocean view from this room that Mr. and Mrs. Gluck desired to preserve the ocean view. And you'll see that the 24-foot line does not cut into the ocean view from the house. They can still see the water.
Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Jacobs, could you point out roughly the eastern portion of the proposed low home?
The two-story portion, or again,
the two-story portion, yeah.
it might be helpful if I took a moment to go backwards into the architectural drawings, which may help you slightly. You can see that this rendering right here is a rendering that would be drawn from the southeast corner of the property. The element here is a one-story element, which is has a deck on top, and that is on the easterlymost end of the house. That is the Gluck end. Then it goes up to a two-story house, but again, it has a hipped roof, so that it's pyramidal back, and there is a ridge which is approximately 50 feet long. That ridge, and approximately, I don't know, maybe my guess would be 6 feet of roof, will be visible from the Gluck residence. And we have photographs that that I believe show that. In fact, you may be able to see the story poles. You can see the story poles here. Do you have the digital photo of this?
That's the vegetation poles.
Those are the vegetation poles. Do you have one just slightly to the right?
See, I don't think you can see the home on your photo. I don't know.
On my photo, you can.
Right here.
And I'll show, not on this one. You're correct. So let's go back to my low quality, low tech approach.
It's
If you can see, there's something
Should
right.
be, yeah, it should be about there.
yeah.
There's a pole right there. It's about the top of it. And there's another pole right there.
And what do they represent?
The
east-
ridge, that's the ridge line of the house right there.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, and then, of course, because it's a hip roof, it slopes back that way, and this slopes back that way. That is the two-story element of the house that will be visible from the Gluck's property. Now, one thing that is of critical importance in understanding the view corridor from the Gluck property is that the view corridor that they have only looks over the northeast triangular portion of the subject property. And you can, again, it's very hard to see in this photograph, but there are large skyline trees. There's trees here, and there's other trees out here, which in effect take out the ocean view looking directly southerly across the Burkhoff Trust property. And really, what they have is a view that looks across this way, slicing across the northeast corner of 700 Picacho Lane. And really their better view is over Mr. Nigro's property, which is to the east of the subject. So we actually did quite a bit of studying of how to create screening that worked. We presented and discussed with the Glucks a study like this, and this was why we went through the story pole process to try and determine the appropriate height for the perimeter screening, where the perimeter screening would be limited, and at what was the appropriate limit. This was our initial proposal, and actually through the process there was an understanding that I believe was reached, with the Glucks saying that 24 feet is really the appropriate height, and it can stop at not 100 feet, but 90 feet in a westerly direction from the northeast corner. And there was probably never full consensus about the line going southerly. In other words, it was going to be 24 feet for at least 175 feet, but beyond that, we didn't have story poles and we didn't know what height it could be set at. You know, it would be higher. It would be 30 feet, maybe 35 feet as you drop down the lot, because the lot is terraced and it all slopes downhill. There is currently a terrace that runs right about through there on the landscaping plan. But we did a lot of studying, and we definitely listened to the Gluck's concerns, and we tried to understand them, and we tried to incorporate them into the building plans in a way that achieved this balance, this very difficult balance that has to be achieved between privacy and consideration of your neighbors. I think we achieved that balance. We agreed that those conditions could be placed on the landscaping plan, and in fact they are shown on the landscaping plan. There are perimeter height limitations that are set forth on the plan itself that was approved by the MBAR. That's very unusual, extremely unusual. But in this case, it was done, and we accepted those conditions. We also looked at the Gluck's concern about what might happen in that triangle. What might happen? They were concerned about potentially having some tall trees that would spring up and would take out a portion of their view. And we got a lot of advice from landscape architects on the MBAR, particularly Sam Maphis, who said, you know, you should do this by species selection. You should select species of trees to use in your landscaping plan in that area that are not going to grow to excessive heights. There were redwoods that were planted by a former owner. There are other older redwoods on the site that have been there for presumably 50 years. We loved the redwoods. We wanted them to stay. The MBAR did not think that redwoods were an appropriate material to use for providing screening, and they asked us to have them eliminated. There are a couple of trees which could conceivably grow into the view plane. If you talk about a view corridor or view plane, there's a couple of Aleppo pines here. Now those are existing trees, at least one of them is existing. They have been topped, and our thought is that those trees would continue to grow. If they will grow, they've been topped once. But they're important in terms of providing screening of the Nigro house to the east, excuse me. And there's also I think I've alluded to it, there's a very distinct difference of opinion in terms of what the relevant view corridor is. The view corridor that is claimed by the Glucks is approximately a third of the site, and I believe that it also goes over the Nigro residence, but that's basically their claim. I think when you go out there and you actually look at the site and you do the geometry and you consider the skyline trees that are already existing in the lower portion of this upper portion of Montecito, there are some very tall trees on Lower Picacho Lane, and there are also some very, very tall trees along East Valley Road, and those take out any view of the ocean that the Glucks would have.
Mr. Jacobs, I understand your discussion and rationale for the hedge to the north. What is the rationale behind the hedge to the right? You're talking about the neighbor there to the right, to the east.
This hedge here,
yes,
it's currently a double hedge. It is Myoporum on 700 Picacho Lane, And Mr. Nigro has his own hedge, which is on his property, and I believe that is a ficus green gem hedge. The goal is to screen the roof of Mr. Nigro's house so that it cannot be seen from 700 Picacho Lane.
And this is the applicant's request or the neighbor's request?
This is the applicant's request, but it's been actually, there's a lot of history on this. These trees and some grading was done in this area by the prior owner, Mr. and Mrs. Brown, because when they were trying to design their house, they wanted to screen out Mr. Nigro's house and Mr. Gluck's house. And when Mr. Weston speaks about a master plan or some such notion, that's just entirely false. There was no master plan. This property was all owned initially by John Peters. It was sold. The Browns purchased one of the parcels. They had a architectural designer named Michael DeRose, and Mr. DeRose designed a house for the Browns that was located in approximately this area, and it was a very unique design. It was less square footage than we are talking about, but it had numerous outdoor rooms. It was a different concept. And that house obviously was never built. There was, to my knowledge, there were never even permits obtained for it. But clearly, the Browns did get permits to put in screening and some fill. I believe they put in 700 cubic yards of fill for purposes of creating the screening that they felt they needed in order to block out the views of this residence and this residence. So I think that we've covered the issues of view. We've done what is right, and we've done what is fair, and we've done what is reasonable, and we've done what is called for under the Montecito guidelines. I think that this view issue is really the ultimate issue. There was virtually no discussion of the architectural plans or the size of the house at the MBAR level. We did get some concerns expressed from neighbors with respect to drainage, and Mr. Nigro was one of the individuals who expressed concern. He was concerned that water would drain, too much water would drain down and potentially flood his access road. We took a very careful look at that. The project engineers did redesigns on the drainage system, and it was my understanding that we had entirely satisfied him with the redesigns that were done. I know that those were presented at the MBAR, and the MBAR agreed with Penfield and Smith that we had adequately dealt with the drainage conditions.
Mr. Jacobs, before you continue, with regard to the hedge to the north, this 24-foot, Mr. Weston indicated that 16-foot might be another option. What is your reaction to that?
My reaction is that neither of the parties would want 16 feet. I don't think that 16 feet does anything for the Glucks in terms of providing them with the screening that they want. You know, presumably they don't want to be looking down onto the Burkhoff Trust's pool and their tennis court. So I believe that we scientifically established that 24 feet was the right height for both properties, and we did that with story poles that were actually, you know, placed and surveyed accurately.
Thank you.
So I think that really view is the issue. It has become the applicants have switched their argument as we move to the Planning Commission, and now they're arguing size. They're saying that the house is simply incompatible with the neighborhood. I think that that's a very difficult argument to make from somebody whose house is actually relatively larger in size than the one that is being proposed. Mr. Gluck's house is 19% over the recommended FARs. Mr. Nigro's house to the east is approximately 18% over. We're 18% over. The property to the immediate west of the subject is 21% over. And all of those numbers are carefully set forth on our floor area study. Again, it's difficult to read. Subject, 18% over. Immediate adjoining neighbor, 18% over. Immediate neighbor, 19% over. Immediate neighbor, 21% over. Immediate neighbor, this one is a large lot, 9 acres. And it's very large. It's actually 2% over, but it's a 9-acre parcel. This is the Lucas property, and I believe Mrs. Lucas is here. And she has submitted a letter in support of the Burkhoff Trust's project. Mr. Weston made some discussions about the relevant neighborhood. In a case like this, I think the relevant neighborhood is really just the immediate grouping of homes. There are 4, 5, 6 homes in this area that are all extremely large. They all have comparable amenities. They all have tennis courts. They all have swimming pools. They all appear to have cabañas. Most of them appear to have guest houses. And it's simply unfair to single out the last remaining unimproved lot and say, you know what, we're changing the rules. We've decided that you can't be part of our neighborhood. You have to have a much smaller house, because in looking at your parcel, we're going to take a bigger area. We're going to go around a quarter mile, and we're going to average in smaller homes that have existed for 30 years, and we're going to use those to calculate what we believe is allowable for your site. You know, essentially, you can't join the club. You got here too late. I think that's fundamentally unfair, and I think that that would be a wrong decision for your commission to make. I would like to go over a few of the guidelines with respect to size, because there was a question about the basic guideline says the floor area of a proposed house should be in scale with development on similar sized parcels in the immediate area. Okay, in my view, the immediate area is that little lane and the houses that immediately surround the little lane. It used to be called Picacho Lane Jr. Those houses are all developed to a fairly extensive standard. They're all fairly comparable in size. They all have comparable amenities. It's just simply unfair to say that the last remaining lot can't have the same things that its neighbors have. Could you go to the next page, Aaron? Yeah, the top first. When you're trying to find exceptions to the guidelines, for example, if you're trying to get approval for a house that is substantially in excess of the guidelines, there are two basic exceptions to the rule. And I like to think of them as, first, the invisibility exception, and the second one is the neighborhood compatibility exception. The invisibility standard says that if your property is not visible from any other property, then it doesn't matter how big it is. Now, if that doesn't apply, you go to the other standard. It's an or, and that's pretty clear. So the first part of the test is that we'll have the burden of demonstrating the project cannot be viewed by surrounding property owners due to siting, or that its spatial volume, mass, bulk, and scale, when taken together with its lot size, setbacks, and landscaping, does not make it incompatible with the surrounding properties. Mr. Weston reads that or as an and. I think he's wrong. He's also trying to assert that these guidelines are more than just guidelines. And that's, you know, that's a different discussion that has to happen at a different place, and there has to be complete public comment on that, and there has to be a decision by the Board of Supervisors, presumably, to change the standard. But right now, we're working with the adopted Montecito guidelines that are not new, as suggested in the appellant's letter. They've been in place since '95. There are no surprises. They're interpreted the same way by the MBAR and have been for at least 10 years. And I think that it would be a travesty if you were to come up with a different interpretation of the guidelines at this point to consider something other than house size. Mr. Weston is advocating for a position where you would consider total build out of the site. That's just not the rules, and I'm astounded that that's the argument, but that's what it is. I would like to draw particular attention to the note, which is set forth at the bottom in bold. It says, note, in certain neighborhoods, the recommended maximum size in Table 1 may not reflect the appropriate level of development. In those cases, neighborhood compatibility will be the determining factor. These are just guidelines. You can't use them as any hard and fast rule. In this case, the subject property is entirely consistent with the properties that are immediately surrounding it. This is a little discrete neighborhood all of its own. If it were a little neighborhood on a little lane like it is, and all of the homes were cottage-sized, even though they were 3.5 acres, it would probably be appropriate to restrict the improvements on it to a similar cottage-type home. We have proposed an estate quality home which is very comparable to all of the other homes that are on the immediately surrounding neighborhood. So I'm happy to answer any questions. If there are specific questions about the architecture, Don Nolte is here and can respond to those.
Commissioner Tilcher, did you have a question?
Thank you, Chairman McGrivian. All these years when realtors said the house has got $1 million view, that's what we're talking about today, really. Probably maybe in excess of that. We certainly don't want to be in a position to negotiate anything between the applicant and the appellant, but I really have heard from Mr. Weston that the biggest issue is not the house, it is the view shed. Now, maybe I heard that wrong, and that 24-foot hedge is not a privacy issue for Mr. Gluck so much as a view problem. And so when I brought up, maybe we could reach some kind of compromise and the hedge be 16 feet or the maximum 18 feet, that both parties would feel that they could live with it. So when you said that the Glucks wanted that 24 feet for their own privacy as much as the applicant, I didn't get that impression. So I feel that maybe there's a communication problem here more than what we're hearing.
That's possible, and certainly we understood that the 24-foot height limitation was what was acceptable. And there are many ways in which the Glucks could have controlled their destiny with respect to this issue. The subject property, 700 Picacho Lane, was on the market for a number of months. It was openly marketed. It was available for purchase. The adjoining neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Gluck, could have easily purchased the lot, reserved the easement that they apparently desire, and then resold the lot. That would be an economically efficient way to handle this. And it was not pursued.
Any other questions? You have other speakers that would like
Yes.
to participate. Let me ask, Chairman Span, are you available after lunch? Good. All right, let's continue with the speakers, and then I think what we'll do is, after that break for lunch, and then come back for Chairman Span's comments and for public comment. I have something like 15 speaker slips here, so that'll take almost an hour. So if you'll continue, Mr. Jacobs.
I'm concluded with my presentation unless you have any additional questions afterwards. Rob, would you like to come on up?
Mr. Jacobs, one question, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
Do you consider the height limitation on the hedges imposed by MBAR to be a burden on the property?
Yes.
Thank you.
And if I could go a little bit further with that, it is, like any plan condition, it is binding on subsequent owners. Now, the difficulty, and being honest with you, the difficulty is that you have to go to the county to get it enforced. But it's thoroughly binding on subsequent owners, in my opinion.
Chairman McGriblian, as a matter of procedure, I wanted to alert you that we accommodated the applicants by having the hearing today, but Mr. Glock has to leave for Washington, D.C. About 1:30, so he won't be here for the balance of the hearing, but we would appreciate it if you would hear his testimony before he has to leave town. Not now, but at the conclusion of it.
Well, it's 11:30 now, so I think I'll continue with the applicant's presentation.
Of course.
At the
I just wanted
conclusion
to
of that,
alert
if
you that
Mr. Gluck would like
I
to
just wanted
speak.
to alert you that he would appreciate a chance to speak.
Thank you for your comment.
Mr. Chairman, I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask. I think probably of Mr. Nolte.
Good afternoon, or good morning.
Good afternoon, Mr. Nolte. There's the couple of questions I have to do with the elevation drawings that were presented to us.
Yes.
Okay. And I noticed that there's an existing grade and then there's a proposed grade. So is that the difference in there between the existing grade and the proposed grade? Is that part of your grading, or is that part of the letter that we've received that says the site had been previously graded?
The previous grading happened many years ago.
Right. Well, we just received a whole bunch of stuff. So and I'm looking at this. So your application is proposing to raise the existing grade today up, right?
Yes, there's a couple.
And how much is that?
It looks like I'm just got the elevations myself. It looks from 1 to 3 to 4 feet in certain locations, but I'd say on average 2.5 feet. And
Okay.
The height calculation, of course, is based from that grade, which we're treating as original.
From the existing grade, yeah. And so I'm assuming, given that the house is 38 feet tall. I had to look at my magnifying glass. That we've got probably 10-foot plate heights here.
There's 11 and 10.
11 and 10.
Yes.
And then are there actually rooms up where the dormers are?
No.
No. So that's all decorative. The height of the roof and the dormers, that's all just part of the general design vernacular,
Correct.
I think we would say.
And the basement is fully underground without any walkout or windows.
Oh,
also.
good. That was my next question.
Okay.
How did you know, Mr.
I had a
Nolte?
feeling we were
was
going there.
To ask that question. Okay, thank you for that. And then the other question I have, and maybe you can't answer this, but I notice on the site plan that there are a couple of oaks that are impacted along the western edge of the driveway right before it comes into, I've kind of made a little mark on my little drawing. Now, are those oaks to be, I can't really tell whether those are oaks to be removed or are those oaks that are just going to be impacted by the driveway?
They're going to be removed, and working with an arborist, we were going to jog the road around it. And the arborist actually, we got into a discussion where he would actually prefer that we got the whole creek riparian area mitigated and cleaned up and restored in exchange for a removal of a couple of oaks and replanting on a basis of 10 to 1 along the left side. The landscape plans addressed all the mitigation of, or addition of new oaks to replace the 2 or 3 that we're taking out, plus a full riparian restoration on the
So we're going to do a 10 to 1 replacement of oaks, and those are going to be in the western side of the property?
They're sprinkled all over up by the
Okay.
guest house, and along the drive, we're going to create a new oak woodland there. Again, the beautiful, I don't know if you're able to visit the riparian area up in the northwest corner, but that's a beautiful area, and it's choked with ivy and non-natives.
Right. Standard for Montecito. We call those invasive species, I think, in our community. Now, the other question that I had, Mr. Nolte, about the oaks is that it appears from the aerial photograph, okay, that there's this very large oak. And according to the drawings, as far as I can tell at this point, because they're rather small, that oak now exists, is being left on site, but is surrounded, as far as I can tell, with paving. Is that accurate?
No, it's not. It's in a natural depression now, and it seems to be thriving. It's been that way since the grading occurred many years ago.
Right.
And we have designed the landscape around that to
But isn't
allow
it,
It's not paving,
isn't
though.
it inside, isn't it inside a large
Oh, that's all lawn.
veranda? Oh, that's lawn.
Yeah, and those steps that you see on the southernmost portion, those are all lawn terraces with just a little stone curb step. So that
Okay, thank you for
Yeah.
clarifying that.
Yeah,
That
it'll-
it was just, I went, how did this ever happen? Okay, so I got that. Okay, that's all my questions that I have for Mr. Nolte.
Okay, and I just would like to point out one thing. I think we were talking about the visibility of the house from the Gluck's property. Early on, I met with Mr. and Mrs. Gluck about placing the house to see their view and to see what really was going to be important here. And there's an existing, maybe you could put this. And there is an existing line of trees in this area that the Gluck stated to me was really not that important part of the view for them. Press the button. This area here is heavily wooded, but beyond that, there's screening over here that even if our house were below or invisible, their view is still impacted by trees off-site. And so this was the area that was identified where we would be most concerned. So the building got sited here. The second story of the house is the dark line, and we tried to keep that out of the area. There's a small area, like I said, Mr. Jacobs said, 50 feet long, where 5 or 6 feet of the black slate roof will be visible. But that existing vegetation in that area will continue to grow, and he does not seem to care about that because of the higher vegetation which is much higher. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Nolte. The applicant, please.
Chairman McGrebley, given Mr. Gluck's schedule, I think it would be appropriate to allow him to speak.
He is able to change his plane flight, so it'll be okay.
Okay.
Good morning, almost afternoon.
Good morning.
Thank you for having me in front of you today. I'll try to make my remarks brief because we have a lot of speakers, but as an actor with a camera and a microphone, it could get ugly. So, I have a late letter that I wanted to put into the record from Tony Wilson, who's a neighbor at 777 Picacho Lane in support of our project, so I'll give that to you. I also want to acknowledge Joyce and Fred Lucas, who are here today in support of our project, who are also our direct neighbors right below us. Jeff Barbaco has a letter, who is a neighbor next to Mr. Filippini as well. Mr. Nigro and I had met earlier to discuss the plans, and I showed him the plans, and at that point he said he would not object to the plans. He's here today. I'm not sure where that is at, but my understanding was that he would not object. I just wanted to come before you to give you a little thought on how we came to buy this property. It's a big investment for me. It's the biggest investment that I have. When I bought it, I spoke with my realtor and Mr. Nolte and said, what can we build here? And we looked around at the neighborhood, saw what was compatible, and with the caveat that you needed to go through the appropriate processes and get the appropriate approvals, I bought the lot based on what we felt that we could build. In the meantime, Mr. and Mrs. Gluck raised their concern about their view, and as you've heard countless times, and I'm sure we'll hear countless more times, we've really tried to come to some sort of agreement. They want a view easement. We've been unable to do that. In all of the processes leading up to this moment, the entire bulk of the discussion has been about view. When we were unable to come to a conclusion, it is switched now to house size. So let's talk about house size. Like I said, this is the biggest investment I have. This is going to be my dream house. I'm going to raise my kids here, hopefully. The MBAR gave us a unanimous 6-vote, I believe, approval on this. And I would just urge you today to not change course midstream on the way the prevailing winds have been blowing, not only with the neighborhood, historically, with everybody else having what they have. As Chris says, hopefully it's not a club that once you get in the lifeboat, you pull the rope up. And I think it would set a very bad precedent. I would just urge you to follow the MBAR and staff's recommendation and deny the Gluck's appeal. But I just wanted to personally tell you that we've worked really long and really hard to try to come to a solution, and I think this is with the Glucks. And I think this is just a case where it's a private individual is unable to agree. And I thank you for your time, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Lowe.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, Chip Woolbrandt. I also provided a letter to you timely on Friday, and so I hope you've had a chance to look at that. I represent Norm Waite, and Mr. Waite, actually similar to the presentation you just heard from Mr. Lowe, came to this property in 2001 and had some expectations. He looked around the neighborhood. At that time, Mr. Nigro had built the houses to both the north and to the east. And so he had an expectation about what could be developed based upon the sizes of those houses, which, as actually Mr. Weston, I think, well presented, are the houses. One of them Mr. Weston called the aberration in the neighborhood, but it actually is the immediately adjacent house. It is similar in size also to the Gluck's house, and so that was the expectation that Mr. Waite had at that time. One of the things I do want to go through quickly, even though you do have my letter, is I do want to go, and I'll go very quickly through some of the photos that we have there, because I think the history on this property is very important. When Mr. Waite bought the house in 2001, these were the views looking to the north and to the Gluck house. And I mentioned that actually you can barely see the Gluck house, and so I'm going to try and point out there is here, and you'll be able to recognize this later, but that's a chimney. And so that was the view in 2001 that you had of the Gluck house. If you could slide that up, yeah. This is another chimney. Again, you can see there's a chimney there. So this is what the lot looked like in 2001 when Mr. Waite bought the property. One of the other interesting things, I think that Mr. Weston talked a lot about the requirement for oversized houses, and one of the requirements that allow you to have what I'll call oversized houses is if they're, and I think Chris called it the invisibility exception. And from my review of the file, That's how the Gluck house was approved and the Nigro house was approved, is because you couldn't see them based upon the existing landscaping at the time they were built. And remember, again, they were approved and built after the guidelines were in place. And both had extensive landscape plans which showed that they were going to have landscaping on the southern and western parcel lines to, again, block the views of those houses.
In just a moment, Commissioner Tilser,
Yes.
do you have
Thank
a
you,
question?
Mr. Chairman. I don't like to interrupt your presentation, but as you go through the pictures, would you be kind enough to just go back to the first picture and tell us where that picture's taken in relationship to the proposed house? Is it?
This is, and I think I will have it about right. This is taken from here. So this is taken basically from the back. If you were in the proposed house and looking north from the proposed house at the mountains there, this is what you would have seen. So, and again, it was very important to Mr. Waite that he not see his neighbors. That's why he bought this particular lot. We had a number of discussions with purchasers, including Mr. Jacobs on behalf of the Lowe's last year, and they were concerned about the lack of privacy of the house. So we actually went out there, and Mr. Waite went out and was shocked at what he saw. This is from basically the same location. This is the view in mid-2005. So those chimneys that I mentioned, and this may help you in orienting yourself, those are the chimneys. You can now clearly see the chimneys. The trees that used to help block that view have now been trimmed and thinned. The other view that was very important to Mr. Waite, and as I understand was very important in approval of the Nigro house, was the view to the east. And the Nigro house is a fairly large, fairly imposing structure. This is what the view to the Nigro house looked like, again, from approximately that same area in here in 2001. And so you can see sort of the front and some of those chimneys. Many things about the Nigro house and the Gluck house architecturally look similar. If you can go to the lower one. Again, you could in 2001, so this is 5 years ago, you could see some of the back of the house, and again, part of that chimney. This is an Aleppo pine, and Aleppo pines were actually planted on the site as part of, when the houses were approved, it was part of what was done to help shield the views from this property. As I think Mr. Weston noted, there actually was one single owner of these 3 parcels who divided the parcels. That owner actually did both landscaping on the properties. Actually, I think that Mr. Nigro ended up doing that landscaping, but there was landscaping on the properties. And also, Mr. Peters, that owner, did a lot of grading and landscaping on the subject property. And I provided you today, and I hope you will give me the same deference you gave to Mr. Weston and include this in your record, but I provided you a copy of the actual county grading permit from 1989 and a letter describing the purpose of the grading permit in 1989. And as that letter says, and it is a letter, again, it's from Design Works Construction, but the permit shows that Design Works was the agent for Mr. Peters, and I'll just read a quick part of it. The owner has expressed his desire to plant numerous trees throughout the property to provide a park-like setting similar to the northwest portion of the property, which is already well established with trees. This grading permit, unlike the subsequent Brown permit, this was actually for a substantial amount of earth. It was, I believe, approximately 14,000 cubic yards of earth, grading, and lots of trees. Commissioner Gottstanker may know more about the trees that were planted. I don't know, but there was substantial grading and trees put in place, again, to create this park-like setting throughout the property. Interestingly, the area right in here behind the big oak tree was not planted in that way, but the stuff all around the perimeter was planted in that way. If I can go to this next slide, and again, you've seen the Nigro house before. This is when we had our potential buyers complain and say, gosh, there doesn't seem like a lot of privacy from this lot. This is the Nigro house after. And again, there's that chimney, that you could barely see that part of the structure. You now see the roof structure, the chimney, and as you can see, there's that Aleppo pine. It's still there, but this part of the planting is quite a bit shorter. And if you could slide up. Again, there's the Aleppo pine that was supposed to help screen the house. It is still doing that to a certain extent, but as you can see, more of the house is now visible. We went out in response to the concerns. We looked at the property, and actually, Mr. and Mrs. Gluck were represented back in 2005 because we sent them a letter telling them that they didn't have authority to come on to Mr. Waite's property and to cut or thin the trees. We also went out and went specifically over what had been there before with Mr. and Mrs. Brown, and they told us that they had planted some large acacias all along the northerly part of the property, a number of other trees all along the northerly part of the property. And these are, and I'm going to say, I don't know who cut the trees. Mr. Gluck, after we went out for a site visit, told us that he did not cut the particular trees I'm going to show you, but someone did, and the trees clearly were cut at some point. So quickly, these are the cut trees. If you can just slide up. As you can see, they were cut fairly low, and they've started growing back in 2005. Got another just real quick picture, but I want to tell you, we had then a landscape architect go out. We had Sidney Baumgartner go out and give us an opinion because we were headed potentially toward litigation at this time. So we got an opinion on when those were cut. She told us that they had been cut at that point in the last 3 years before that point. She also gave us some recommendations on what we could do simply to reestablish the privacy and landscaping that had been there already. We implemented her recommendations. They were primarily to start taking care of, again, the hedging, screening, and water it. And she told us that if we took care of it, that hedging and screening would grow at a rate of about 4 feet per year and would eventually grow back up so you would no longer see the Gluck house. She also looked around the site, and there are a number of large redwood trees on the site. She recommended to us that we plant a row of redwood trees along that section of the property and said that would immediately reestablish what had been there in 2001. So it wouldn't have the extra 4 years of growth at that point, but it would reestablish what had been there in 2001. She also told us that redwoods were an appropriate hedging plant because one of the other issues, this property does have a view to the north, and it actually has a nice mountain view. So while from the property you don't want to look at the house to the north, you do want to look at the mountains, so you want something that grows up high enough to block the house, but not so high to block the mountains. And she told us that those redwoods were an appropriate tree. I will tell you that Mr. Waite spent about $60,000 on those redwoods. They were planted as very large trees. They were planted at great expense. They've now been in the ground since last June, so they are now fully established. If I can just close by going to Mr. Weston's view from the property, do you have that? Or actually either of the views that show the Nigro house in them. I'll just say I have been very confused and amazed by the presentation that has been given, claiming that it is the house and the house size which is at issue. Again, we're standing in a house looking from the house that is right now 19% over FARs, so more over FARs than the house that's proposed. These story poles are of plants, of trees. They're not of a house. This thing here, which clearly, and if you saw the view farther on, you pick up more ocean view over here, this thing here is clearly in the view corridor from this house. The same person built the house we're standing in and this house, and clearly was not greatly concerned about view blockage when he put this house, actual structure which is subject to your guidelines, in the middle of the view. And so, again, this seems entirely, and with all due respect to Mr. Gluck, he may think that he was promised something. He may think he was entitled to the something. But this is all about trying to get your commission to grant a view easement based upon limitation on trees in Montecito to a homeowner in a large house. To me, one of the things that defines Montecito are the trees. I don't live in this particular neighborhood. I have friends there and I spend a lot of time in this neighborhood. One of the things to me that defines this particular neighborhood are the large trees, including redwoods. And so I'm sort of here as both on behalf of Mr. Waite, but he planted the trees, and so I'm sort of here as a friend of the trees. I would ask you to deny the appeal because I believe the appeal as presented has no merit. It has nothing to do with architectural guidelines, house size, or anything other than the trees. And I would also urge you to not set the precedent of limiting people from having redwood trees at their house. And I would urge you to actually eliminate the condition imposed by the Planning Commission. I think if you want to keep the hedge height, and the Lowe's are happy with the hedge height at 24 feet, I think that's between them. I would just urge you to eliminate the prohibition on it being redwood trees, because the effect will be that these redwood trees that have now been fully established will have to be cut down. And I'll tell you, we actually, because we have the ability to get the redwood trees back if they're not approved, we've looked at the cost to get the redwood trees back. The cost to dig the redwood trees up, rebox them, put them with giant cranes on giant trucks and truck them back out is far greater than the cost to acquire other redwood trees of that size. And so it would not happen, and again, the effect would be that these now mature redwood trees would be cut down.
Mr. Wilbrand, I have a question for you.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
I think the MBAR indicated the hedge height would be determined perhaps by selection of vegetation that would only grow to roughly that height, 25 foot.
I think in this instance, and this is kind of a strange one, and landscape conditions are strange ones. I would note that there was actually a landscape condition, there was landscaping in a landscape plan for both what is now the Gluck House and for the Nigro House. The plants shown were the same plants. They were green gem ficus. They were shown to be planted at 24-inch box size on 10-foot centers. Those green gems at 24-inch box size on 10-foot centers on the Nigro House have now grown in as a screening hedge. On the Gluck House, they've been cut and maintained to not be a screening hedge. I think the intent was that they be a screening hedge. But to answer your specific question, my understanding of the condition as to just that northern boundary was that both the redwoods had to be removed because there was a speciation concern, and that the height had to be maintained just along that section at 24 feet. I don't know what that means for the existing oak trees and other trees that are actually there in that area. I do know that the appellants have sought an easement that would actually allow them to go in and cut both hedges and trees in a view corridor section. They have talked about, and I forget the term, but they had a term about specific particular trees of concern. I think those are the two Aleppo pines, one of which is there and blocks the Nigro House. The other is intended to block the Nigro House. So again, as I understand, the current conditions would call for the hedge to be trimmed at 24 feet, which both sides agreed, helps hide the Gluck House with still allowing them the view that they said was very important. And I went over to their house on that site visit and saw the view they said that was important and the story poles, and it was my understanding that 24 feet was what they thought was the right height at that time.
Okay. Now, you also indicated, you made some comments about the redwoods and topping those for one reason or another. I don't know of any landscape architect that would be enthusiastic about topping a tree.
Actually, we provided you with copies of a letter from Sidney Baumgartner, a well-respected local landscape architect. I don't know if we included the attachment to her letter, but an attachment to her letter was a page from the Sunset Western Garden book, which she calls the Bible. And the Sunset Western Garden book talks about trimming redwoods, these particular types of coastal, I think they are coastal redwoods is what they're called, talks about trimming them as appropriate hedge plants. And so apparently, according to the Bible, one regularly does do that.
Commissioner Phillips?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wildebrandt, you represent Mr. Waite, is
Yes,
that correct?
that is correct.
And Mr. Waite owns this property?
No, Mr. Waite owned the property in mid-2005 when we learned of the tree trimming, and I'll use that term because again we don't know who did the massive cutting, but he's planted the trees. He subsequently sold the property to the Burkhoff Trust.
So why you were moving trees just a few minutes ago?
We have
and the expense associated.
We
why
have
are you
we
moving
have the right
trees?
to get the trees back.
Oh, you can get the trees back.
If you end up saying that they can't have the trees there, that these trees that have now been in the ground for well over a year
Mr. Waite
must
gets to
go
keep them.
away. If Mr. Waite wants to go and get them again, he is allowed to. What I mentioned is, at this point, what he would get is some very small, skinny firewood or some really nice, big, giant Christmas trees, because they would basically be cut down at the ground.
And when you were representing Mr. Waite, there was no agreement with Mr. Gluck that would bind the Lowe's?
Absolutely not. There was no agreement that would allow Mr. Gluck to come on the property and trim. I have not ever represented Mr. Brown, so to a certain extent, what I say about Mr. Brown is hearsay, but you have a letter also from Mr. Brown where he says that he didn't provide such a right, and in fact his letter says he was asked for one, and Mr. Brown made that representation to Mr. Waite as the interim owner of the property.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, you have how many more speakers here?
Thank you very much.
Just one. And then Mr. Gluck wish to speak?
Thank you, Chair McGrebley and Commissioners. Thank you. I am going to make it very brief because I imagine that you'd like to go to lunch. And I think that the rest of our team has very, in a compelling way, made the points that we wanted to make today. I'm just going to take a moment to underscore a couple of the points that have already been made. With respect to neighborhood compatibility first, I really appreciate the discussion that you are having amongst yourselves about the floor area ratios and how they're interpreted and how they're applied. And it sounds like you want to have a bigger discussion about that. They've been in place now for quite a number of years, and perhaps there's been something that's been learned as they've been applied, and you want to have that dialogue, and I think that's good. And as members of the community and people that advise applicants and represent applicants through the process, I look forward to having that discussion in a public forum, and I think that's probably appropriate. However, you apply the FARs in this case, no matter how you slice it, I think the result is that this project is compatible in its neighborhood. Whether you look at just the adjacent properties themselves and how they fare with respect to applying the FAR guidelines, or you look at the bigger neighborhood, it is very clear that there are properties surrounding this project site that are comparable in size and in development. I think you can draw a funny line probably and pick up certain parcels and certain developments within the area and come to a different conclusion, but that wouldn't, that just isn't appropriate. And if you step back even further away from the aerial photo and you just think about this as a larger neighborhood, which it is, this is a neighborhood of estates. Are there smaller parcels and smaller homes? Yes. But for more than 100 years, this heart of Montecito has, estates have been developed here and they're celebrated. So I just don't think there's a question about that. Secondly, I do believe the decision before you is extremely straightforward. This was an administrative project, and for good reason. It's consistent, as staff has told you in their staff report, with policy. And the MBAR, which I think we're all very grateful, is in place with dedicated professionals who know what they're doing, and I don't think that architects can game them, as was stated. There was a unanimous decision to approve this project. It wasn't a split vote. There's no borderline issues here of interpretation. It was a unanimous approval. So I think, out of respect to your staff and to the MBAR, which has professionals seated on it, this project was unanimously approved. So I just wanted to underscore those 2 points. And have a good lunch. We'll see you afterwards, I suppose.
Thank you, Ms. Elledge, but I must make a comment that we always respect the staff, and we always respect the MBAR, but if we disagree, that does not mean we lack respect. Mr. Gluck?
Mr. McGravian, I have decided to change my flight so we can have our lunch break. I don't want to disrupt the process, and I'll speak after lunch at the appropriate time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Gluck. Chairman Span, do you want to wait until after all those comments are completed?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
All right, then I think what we can do is break for lunch at this time. And let's get back here by 1:15. Session.